Hi, everyone. I am David Lipton from The Reckoning, July 4th, 2030. This podcast is about those historical moments when the political campaigner becomes the button pusher. As in our earlier podcasts, my granddaughter, Alicia, and I are walking along the Long Island shore, staring at the Chinese ships easily visible to us and reflecting how and why all this happened. We are wondering where our Navy is, why our nation is bankrupt, and why she cannot find a steady, well-paying job. Alicia is also living with me in our ancestral home in Long Island. And we're both wondering why we never heard that the Chinese even had a fleet that was capable of attacking our shores. Something magical happens when a person running for political office is elected. Everything that person knows is completely reversed the very moment he or she takes office. On running for office, what people say is more important than what they do, because all they are doing is running a campaign and making promises. Many of those promises will never be filled. In fact, they're not even remembered after they campaign. Talk is cheap and making promises is easy. Once in office, every person, and that includes everyone here and abroad, has a far greater interest in what that office holder does rather than what he or she says. When I say everyone, I mean it, especially where foreign leaders are concerned. During a political campaign, everyone understands that the promising and the flip-flopping is nothing more than political theater. But after the campaign, things change very rapidly. Confusing or conflating words with deeds costs nothing during a campaign because there are no deeds, only words. We know this. Foreign leaders know this. Actions and only actions count. This is particularly true of U.S. presidents and other officials in charge of public policy. What might those actions be? My granddaughter is always prodding me for more historical information. It is difficult for me to answer her because her questions push me into remembering and reliving past times that I would rather forget. Nevertheless, she keeps prodding me on. Grandfather, here are 5 questions for you. 1. Why did the USA abandon a policy that contained our enemies abroad in the Eastern Hemisphere? 2. Why did we not use enough military force abroad when it was needed? 3. Why did we not provide more financing, ammunition, and intelligence to our friends when they needed our help? Why did we abruptly change economic policies with other countries? And finally, 5th, did our leaders act with gravitas, that is, in a level-headed, steady, and consistent manner, or not? In the first place, Alicia, when it comes to actions, what goes around comes around. There is no middle ground. There is no place to hide. Actions speak far louder than words. I started with the thought that actions speak louder than words and went down my usual historical path with her. Once again, I ruminate to myself that it is a real shame that no one educated her in high school or in university on what really happened in the world. True, the internet is filled and was filled with a bewildering array of facts, data, videos, true and false narratives, real narratives, AI-generated narratives. But she and her peers have no way of navigating their way through that morass of raw information because they lack the compass of factual, historical knowledge. Giving her this knowledge has become my job. Here we go again, once more into the historical gap. Do you remember, Alicia, when we talked about how the U.S. managed to lose NATO, the Ukraine, and Western Europe over 2 decades? Do you recall that the Chinese won the trade war with the U.S. over the same period and successfully invaded Taiwan. Do you also remember that I talked about the U.S. and public presidents tended to waver inconsistently between a chronic indignation and a cosmic feeling that we, the U.S., had all the answers to the world problems? I sure do, Granddad. You were very convincing on that point, that we neglected our strategic interest of fighting our battles in the Eastern Hemisphere, far away from our shores. You got that right, Alicia. Now I'm going to get more specific on the actions of our presidents in talking the talk, but not consistently walking the talk. I have selected 4 historical examples of U.S. action spanning 100 years to demonstrate that our nation's actions spoke louder than our words, and that for the most part those actions were inconsistent. With one exception, our actions and policies often dismayed our allies and encouraged our enemies. First, President Woodrow Wilson, in his 14 points address in 1918, before the war ended, World War I, and then the Senate rejection of the Versailles Treaty and the League of Nations in 1919 to 1920. The war was to end all wars. Well, it didn't. The war for democracy didn't accomplish its goals. You may recall, or not, that President Wilson was, when he arrived in Paris, was treated as a god that was going to solve all problems. And a year later, when he left, he was a beaten old man with his tail between his legs. Wilson and the U.S. Senate were unable to agree on the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. So we cut everyone loose and turned our backs on the world. It was called isolationism in those days, and afterwards, leading up to World War II. Second, the policy of containment and the Cold War from 1946 to 1991 towards the Soviet Union. That was an unqualified success. We were consistent. From Presidents Harry Truman to Ronald Reagan, we triumphed over the Soviet Empire by containing Russian and communist aggression around the world. Third, engagement and hasty withdrawals. Vietnam, 1962 to 1975, and then the Afghanistan War, 2001 to 2021. Failure in both countries. Why? We didn't stay the course. From Vietnam, involvement from Presidents John Kennedy to Gerald Ford, and then in Afghanistan, from Presidents Bush to President Biden, we failed to hold the line with our allies who were fighting in those areas. And then fourth, there's President Donald Trump, 2024 to 2028. It was a time of abrupt policy reversal. Tariffs arbitrarily imposed on our allies and enemies alike. NATO and Western Europe cut loose an unpredictable intervention in the Middle East, from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. We came and we went, and no one knew what we were doing. Taiwan was conquered by China, with the U.S. unwilling and unable to respond in any significant way. Japan, South Korea, and Australia were left to their own devices. That's why those ships are out there. Sure, each president is different and has his own way of doing things, but there's a striking century-long pattern of inconsistent behavior where we abandon a hard-headed calculation of our long-term strategic interests of keeping our enemies outside our hemisphere. Alicia, I have given you a bare-bones summary of the overarching pattern of U.S. actions and interventions abroad, regardless of who the presidents were. It all turned out the same way. Still, here we are in 2030, living the consequences of our greatly reduced nation. Nevertheless, we still have, as we always have had, the choice to make our own future by changing our actions. I believe we will be up to the task of effectively defending our republic. My listeners can access my ideas and thoughts by visiting Amazon.com and search for The Reckoning, July 4th, 2030. Several days after this podcast, release on this YouTube channel an engaging conversation, it's AI generated, on how political campaigners became button pushers who generated policy results very different and often the very opposite of the results they intended. Stay tuned.